What's up, fam? Extraordinary Life with Elijah. And I said last week that it was going to be a 3-part series on your sons and daughters will prophesy, your young men will see visions, your old men will dream dreams. But we're going to actually shift this up and we're going to move old men dream dreams to week 2. As I've been engaging this series on talking about the leadership paradigm, just the way of life, the schema approach to life of reproductive respiration, I've been going through this relationship that exists that's outlined in Acts chapter 2 and Joel chapter 2 of your sons and daughters will prophesy, your young men will see visions, your old men will dream dreams. That I believe that those 3 definitions of generational connection are connected in an intimate and dynamical system. Now, if you haven't seen last week's video, last couple weeks, where I talk about the overview of reproductive respiration, some of the key principles and foundations of it, and last week's and talking about your sons and daughters will prophesy, go back and watch those. That's gonna help a lot with today's video. But today, I'm gonna merge that 3rd category into number 2. I think it's gonna be a lot more effective. And it's that 3rd aspect of your old men will dream dreams. Now, overall, historically, there's been a lot of tension between sons and daughters and old men, between the youngsters and the oldsters. In that context, that both of them have very different needs and different perspectives on life that often create a lot of tension between the two. Youth are just starting out. They haven't had lots of experiences because it's the first time that they've experienced something. They think it's the best thing ever, not realizing that aged people have been experiencing those things their entire life. It's exciting and new and wild because they're experiencing it for the first time. It's not so revolutionary for older people. They've been in it for a long time. Likewise, youth have a lot of flexibility physically and within the ability to make mistakes, that there's a lot of time to recover, and when kids either metaphorically or physically hit the ground, they bounce. Older people, though, have worked for a long time. They've experienced a lot of life. They've seen failures and successes, and they understand the repercussions of decisions, and as a result, they've worked their way into a place where they have a way of life or resources that if they threaten it and lose it at this venture in life, that they do not metaphorically and physically bounce as well as kids do. As a result, older people, older generations can tend to become inflexible and stiff in their ways, whereas youngsters are very nimble and flexible and are always wanting to try new things. Now, those are just some of the dynamics that exist within this pairing of the sons and daughters and grandmas and grandpas. God, though, has ordained these to be together in community in a dynamical system of sons and daughters, young people and elderly people. This all exists to create momentum in a legacy of faith. Now, one of my favorite examples that highlights this so well is the story of Saul and David. Now, in the context of me talking about the dynamical blessing that is, I want to invite you to divorce in your mind the thought that Saul was rejected of the Lord, that David was the anointed of the Lord, and that Saul was an example of fallen faithfulness. I love the dynamics and the story and the interaction from a redeemed context of an older generation and a younger generation being paired together in the forward advancement of God's kingdom. Now, if you'll remember when David came to deliver the food to his brothers in the midst of the battle, that he was tending to sheep, that he was outside of the day-to-day context of the warfare and the battle and this unfolding experience of engaging Goliath coming out every day and yelling his threats and lies and people shrinking back. David didn't have any access to that. He was just growing in the Lord, learning to hear the Lord's voice, developing testimony off by himself and the Lord's power on his life. He just merges into this situation unconstrained by past experience. Now, when he merges into this context, Goliath is coming out as he usually did and was spouting his lies and blasphemy against God. And David is absolutely livid. He has no comprehension of why this giant is being allowed to taunt the living God. Now, there's all kinds of rabbit holes that we can go down with this story. So I'm going to try to stay focused as best as possible. But one aside, that you'll notice that Goliath, in shouting his lies, is saying, "Are you not all servants of Saul? And are we not all Philistines?" False. They were not all servants of Saul. They were servants of the living God. Now, it's very easy over time, just through very small compromises in language and a lack of proactivity in upholding God's ways and his holiness, that there can be slow drift in becoming servants of God and becoming servants of fill in the blank. It could be a denominational position or a leader or a philosophy or whatever it is in your personal life, but that over time, there is a tendency to slowly drift in one direction. David, coming into the context though with fresh ears, hears, "Are you not all servants of Saul?" And David says, "Absolutely not. And why is this loudmouth fool being allowed to mock the living God?" Now, immediately on the heels of this, sons and daughters prophesy, young men see visions, old men dream dreams. The young men begin to abuse the younger, saying, "With whom did you leave all those sheep in the desert? Like, are you not conceited? Like, why did you come here to see the battle?" That's the broken element. The brokenness perpetuates and everyone begins to assault David, question his ability to prophesy and to call the children of Israel back to a holiness of God, until finally David finds himself before Saul. Saul questions David, asks him, "Why should I allow you to go out and fight this man trained in warfare that before your birth he was being trained in warfare?" David gives testimony of the lion and the bear, and Saul does one of the most brilliant and anointed things that he ever did in his kingship. He said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." If you're familiar with the story, then you know that David goes out, he prophesies before he even engages Goliath. It tells the ending and what he's going to do before he does it. He speaks a bold word. He foretells and foretells what's going to happen, and then moves forward in the power of God and manifests the prophetic in reality of tearing Goliath's head off. Now, here in this context is beautifully highlighted the dynamical tension between an older generation and sons and daughters who are prophesying. Previous to this point in King Saul's kingship, the children of Israel didn't have lots of weaponry. It says that there were only 2 swords that were found in all of Israel on the day of battle when Jonathan and his armor bearer went out to confront the enemy. After Jonathan and his armor bearer's victory in that conquest of the Lord's power in them, the children of Israel gained lots of weaponry. Up to that point, they were fighting people with sticks and stones and shovels and plowshares. But after that victory of Jonathan and his armor bearer, the children of Israel gathered in a massive trove of weaponry that they stripped off of the dead. Jonathan had a sword in his hand when he gained this mighty victory, and he and Saul both had swords. And so there's a brokering of power that happens when we have instruments that were present when we succeeded. Obviously, these are what make us powerful, and that's why you should follow us, the king and his son. This apparently had become such a prevalent script that was being told and thought and lived out of that the enemies of God began to refer to the Israelites as the servants of Saul. Now, there was a slow drift that was happening, that the Israelites were beginning to trust in the sword rather than the Lord. And so when a demonic principality showed up in the form of Goliath, wielding a massive sword, it came to shame the king, King Saul, and his prowess in the sword, and to shame him before all of the people, caused them to be fearful and to have the Lord's anointed shrink back, which he did. Went into his tent, took off his armor, and started sending out APBs for ministerial mercenaries to come and live out of his good works and destiny to carry it forward, because ministry's never been harder in this area, and I don't know what to do, and the church is failing, and everything's just going to hell in a handbasket. Sound familiar? I think so. But along comes David, unconstrained by experience and time, and declares prophetically, why is this giant a problem? Why is he calling us the servants of Saul? Why hasn't someone taken his head off yet? And I'm just the guy to do it. In this, all of the elements of generational oppression and abuse are present within the story as well, requiring that the people who come after you, taking up your armor, the things that have made you successful and the things that are deceiving you and leading the people astray, to put those on the next generation and make them go in that, because it saves face. But David says, I can't go in these. And so goes out with the things that he's familiar with God and his relationship and intimacy, but receives the anointing of authority. Go, and may the Lord be with you. Until the next generation of destiny comes under the authority and blessing of those over them, destiny lived before its appointed time will always be the expression of rebellion. However, receiving the blessing and the anointing of authority over the next generation who's walking in the good works that God has given them to do, their outward movement is reformation, transformation, revival, and the fullness of the kingdom's coming. Now, David went out in front of Saul and tore the giant's head off and made a firm declaration. The battle belongs to the Lord, not the sword. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Now, at this juncture, in a redeemed story, in a redeemed telling of this interaction, this dynamical tension between Saul and David, this was the point where your sons and daughters prophesy, where God was imparting grace for Saul to see and to hear. This is the way that the Lord's anointed walks. The battle does not belong to the sword. You don't have to shrink back, hide in your tent, take off your armor, start surrounding yourself with ministerial mercenaries. It's time to dream. When old men receive the prophecy of unconstrained zeal before the Lord in a new work of the next generation, in things that are so far beyond their capacity that it scares them into their tents, and to have them take their armor off, when they hear the prophetic message, oh wow, yeah, I forgot, we can tear the heads off of giants. In that space, the grandfathers and grandmothers of the faith are given the capacity to dream. A dream is a vision of the future that you will neither participate within to bring into being or enjoy the fruits of, but that you establish vision for the future that exists far into the future. It's a dream that, oh man, focus, Elijah, focus. I got this. So the basis of the dreams of the elderly find their footings. It finds the fodder, the substance, the inspiration, the correction, the revelation. It's coming from the sons and daughters. And that when the old people who have eyes to see and ears to hear that prophetic insight and they see the prophetic acts, that they're like, oh, wow, put my armor back on, shack my cane, ask God to give me the hill country, and show the next generation what an 88-year-old man can do up against some giants. Oh man, that is the beauty of the correctly ordered dynamical tension of old men dream dreams, sons and daughters prophesy. The horribly sad ending of Saul's life is that he didn't listen to the prophetic declaration of the sons and daughters in his life. That rather than saying, yes, the battle does not belong to the sword, it belongs to the Lord. At the end of Saul's life, he was being pursued by enemies, and he was seeing his sons and his men being struck down all around him. All of those that he loved and surrounded him, that protected him, were loyal to him, were being robbed from him, slowly stripped from his grasp until it was just him and his armor bearer left. And rather than, like his sons who said, can the Lord save by many and not by few? Let's go taunt all of the enemies with this one sword that we have because it's the Lord who owns the battle. Instead, Saul lived by the sword, and so he died by the sword. That he told his armor bearer to run himself through, and his armor bearer was scared and wouldn't do it, so Saul threw himself on his own sword. And then the next generation who saw what their leader did said, I guess that's what we do. And so his armor bearer, emboldened by his leader's example of living by the sword and dying by the sword, fell on his own sword and died. This is so sad. Not only is it sad in the context of Saul and his armor bearer, but that the same pattern is being replicated today in an older generation who are devaluing the prophetic voice of their sons and daughters, either biologically or spiritually. That God graces the older generation with a prophetic act to call the older generation back into faithfulness and holiness before Him, to end their days out in glory, in faithfulness, in passion, in power before the Lord. That their last act would be to remember when you're backed into a corner and you've been painted in on every side, and the church is declining in America and nothing can be done, and it's getting darker and darker, and what can man do against such evil? What are we going to do? Let's just hide in the bastions of our churches, batten down the hatches, and just hope that we get another Republican president. That in that space, that the older generation would remember that the battle does not belong to the sword but to the Lord, and that the blessing could be in a bride who is so often accused of being adulterous before Jesus, that so many people drag the bride before Jesus and say, look at this whore caught in adultery and friendship with the world. That those who could hear the words of Jesus, that those who could hear His prophetic declaration and correction, would be an older generation who, when having heard Jesus's voice through sons and daughters, would lay down their stones, would lead the line of condemnation and judgment, and lead the way for the young men who stay at the line, that they would lead the way into the battle. Whatever God has destined them to walk within in faithfulness, so that their final days, rather than throwing themselves on their sword, plugging their ears to hear the prophetic declaration of a giant getting his head torn off by the Lord's power being exhibited in an unconstrained, untrained shepherd boy, that they could hear, that the older generation could hear. That the youth are often touted as being the ones who are bringing the revival, and that they're the blessed generation, and that they're anointed, and they are. But my heart is for my fathers. My heart is for my mothers. That they would hear the prophetic voice of their sons and daughters. And rather than throwing themselves on their sword, that they would go out to the battle, and that in their deaths, not being killed by their enemies like Samson was, but that in their passing into glory, that they would destroy more of the enemies of God in darkness in the example of their testimony and blazing glory before the Lord than they ever accomplished in a full lifetime of faithfulness before God. Friends, that is the dynamical tension between old men and sons and daughters. That when sons and daughters grow up in a culture where rather than having old men sending you out to confront your enemies and attempt to get you killed and to trick you and deceive you and manipulate you as Saul did with David, rather than growing up in that culture, when sons and daughters grow up with grandmas and grandpas that listen in rapt attention to the prophetic declarations of their grandchildren, and that when the grandchildren can see grandma and grandpa pulling up armor that they've cast off, straightening their backs and going out to war based on the prophetic declarations of their grandchildren. When the grandchildren, who are sons and daughters, merge into young men and women, there then is a lot more grace to be the Joshua under your Moses, to be the Peter under your Jesus. Friends, God's ways are altogether good. To all perfection, I can see a limit, but his ways are boundless, and I can find none. I hope this has made sense to you. I did my best to keep it as succinct as possible. I chased it in circles. If you have more questions, reach out to me. I'd love to get coffee with you and talk about it some more. If you subscribe to what I am doing, then hit the button. Hit it and then get it. Hit the bell as well so you get notified with the new content. And if you loved this video, didn't just like it, hit the thumbs down button. My sons and daughters are getting it. Kailani always tells me, Dad, I didn't like that video. I didn't like that video at all. She got me one time. First time she did it. Dad, I don't like your drawing at all. You don't? Oh, why not? She looked at me and said, I love it. Sons and daughters prophesy. If you subscribe to what I'm doing, hit the button, hit it and then get it. Hit the bell as well so you get notified with the new content. And if you loved this video, you didn't just like it, hit the thumbs down button. I pray blessings on your day. I love you guys lots. Sons and daughters below me, mothers and fathers above me. I love you guys as well as my contemporaries. And I will see you in the next video.